In the 19th century, County Durham was haunted by a series of mysterious deaths. At the centre stood Mary Ann Cotton, a woman accused of poisoning her family for profit and remembered as Britain's first female serial killer. Hello, welcome to Cold Case UK. County Durham sits in the north-east of England, bordered by the River Tyne to the north and the River Tees to the south. In the 19th century, it was coal country. The landscape was shaped by the industry, pit heads rising out of the fields, terraced rows of colliery houses built close together, men who spent their working lives underground, and women who kept the households running above it. The air carried coal dust. The communities were tight-knit, Methodist, and hard. Life expectancy was short. Infant mortality was high. Death was a familiar presence in every home. When a child died of a stomach ailment, it was sad, but not unusual. When a man died of gastric fever after a short illness, it was mourned and then accepted. In County Durham in the 19th century, death came often and early, and people learned not to ask too many questions. Nestled within this landscape was a small mining village called Low Moorsley. It was a quiet, unremarkable place, a cluster of colliery cottages on the southwestern outskirts of Hetton-le-Hole, surrounded by fields and pit workings. The families who lived there were working people. The men went down the mines. The women raised the children. The church and the chapel marked the rhythm of their weeks. Low Moorsley was not a place that drew attention. It was a place where people were born, worked, and died, and the world outside barely noticed. On the 31st of October 1832 in Low Moorsley, a girl was born and named Mary Ann Robson. She was baptised 11 days later at St. Mary's Church in West Rainton. Her father, Michael Robson, was a colliery sinker, a man who dug the shafts that other men worked in. Her mother, Margaret, née Lonsdale, kept the home. The family were staunch Methodists. Mary Ann was described in her early years as exemplary, tidy in her appearance, regular in her attendance at the Wesleyan Sunday School. Nothing about her stood out. Nothing suggested what was coming. When Mary Ann was still a young child, the family moved to the village of Merton in County Durham, where her father found work at the local colliery. She settled into her new surroundings. She made friends slowly. She attended school. She grew up in the same coal-dusted, chapel-going world that shaped everyone around her. Then, when Mary Ann was approximately 8 or 9 years old, her father fell to his death down a mine shaft at Merton Colliery. His body was returned to the family home in a wheelbarrow belonging to the South Hetton Coal Company. The family was left with nothing. Her mother eventually remarried a man named George Stott. Mary Ann did not get along with her stepfather. At 16, she left home and went to work in the nearby village of South Hetton as a nurse in the household of a colliery manager named Edward Potter. She also trained as a dressmaker. She was, by all accounts, capable, independent, and attractive. In 1852, at the age of 20, Mary Ann married a colliery labourer named William Mowbray at Newcastle upon Tyne Register Office. They soon moved to the southwest of England, where the first of their many children was born. Over the following years, the couple had somewhere between 8 and 9 children. The exact number is uncertain because record-keeping at the time was inconsistent. What is clear is that most of them died. The deaths were attributed to gastric fever, a vague Victorian diagnosis that covered a wide range of conditions, including, as it would later turn out, arsenic poisoning. The symptoms were almost identical: stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and rapid deterioration. The family eventually moved back to the northeast of England. William took out a life insurance policy covering himself and their surviving children. By 1864, William Mowbray was dead. The cause recorded on his death certificate was an intestinal disorder. Mary Ann collected £35 from the British and Prudential Insurance Company. 2 more of their children died in the weeks that followed. Mary Ann sent her surviving daughter Isabella to live with her mother and moved on. Her second husband was George Ward, an engineer she had nursed back to health while working at the Sunderland Infirmary. They married on 28 August 1865 at St. Peter's Church in Monk, Weymouth. Within a year, George Ward was dead. His doctor later gave evidence that Ward had been very ill, but was nonetheless surprised that his death came so suddenly. The cause recorded on his death certificate was English cholera and typhoid. Mary Ann collected the insurance money and moved on again. Her third husband was James Robinson, a widowed shipwright from Pallion in Sunderland. Mary Ann arrived at his home in November 1866, initially as his housekeeper. A month later, Robinson's baby son died of gastric fever. Robinson turned to his housekeeper for comfort, and Mary Ann became pregnant. She went away briefly to visit her mother, who had been taken ill. 9 days after Mary Ann arrived at her mother's bedside, her mother was dead. She was 54 years old. Mary Ann returned to Robinson's household. Over the following months, Robinson's daughter Elizabeth died. Then his son James died. Then Mary Ann's own daughter, Isabella, the child she had sent to live with her mother years before, was brought back into the household. Isabella died too. Mary Ann and James Robinson married on 11th August 1867. They had 2 children together. One died in infancy. Their son George survived. Robinson grew suspicious. Mary Ann pressed him repeatedly to take out a life insurance policy. He refused. He then discovered she had stolen more than £50 from him and run up significant debts, forcing his older children to pawn household belongings to cover them. He threw her out of the house and kept their son George. James Robinson was the only one of Mary Ann's husbands to survive her. Without a home or income, Mary Ann made contact with a friend named Margaret Cotton. Margaret introduced her to her brother, a recently widowed miner named Frederick Cotton, who lived at Walbottle in Northumberland. Frederick had 2 surviving children in his care, his stepson, Frederick Jr., and his young son, Charles Edward Cotton. Margaret Cotton had been caring for them. Within weeks of Mary Ann arriving at the household, Margaret Cotton fell ill with a stomach ailment and died. Mary Ann and Frederick Cotton were married in September 1870. It was a bigamous marriage. She was still legally married to James Robinson. Within months of the wedding, one of Frederick's other children died. Then, in December 1871, Frederick Cotton himself died of gastric fever. Mary Ann collected the insurance payout. By this point, Mary Ann Cotton had outlived 2 of her own husbands, a lover, her mother, and the majority of her children. Most of the people who came into close and sustained contact with her developed the same constellation of symptoms: stomach pain, vomiting, progressive weakness, and died. The pattern was extraordinary. But Victorian England had limited forensic capability, a strong cultural tendency to attribute illness to natural causes, and no reason to look closely at a grieving widow and mother. Mary Ann moved through the northeast of England with barely a raised eyebrow. After Frederick's death, her former lover, Joseph Nattrass, a colliery labourer she had known years earlier, moved in as a lodger. Mary Ann also began a relationship with a local excise officer and became pregnant by him. In the spring of 1872, Frederick Cotton Jr. died. Shortly after, her infant son Robert died. Then, Nattrass fell ill. He revised his will in Mary Ann's favor. Then he died. That left Mary Ann with one remaining child in her care, 7-year-old Charles Edward Cotton, the stepson of her deceased fourth husband. In the summer of 1872, Mary Ann approached a local parish official named Thomas Riley. She told him she wanted Charles Edward sent to the workhouse so that she could take up a nursing position. Riley explained this was only possible if she entered the workhouse with the boy. Mary Ann's reply was later recalled by Riley at her trial. She said the boy was sickly and would not trouble her for long. She said, "He'll go like the rest of the Cottons." 5 days later, Charles Edward Cotton was dead. Riley did not forget what Mary Ann had said. He went to the police. He also persuaded the attending doctor, who was about to issue the death certificate, to delay and to preserve samples from the body for examination. Those samples were tested by Dr. William Byers Kilburn. They contained arsenic. Charles Edward Cotton's body was exhumed. The presence of arsenic was confirmed. Mary Ann Cotton was arrested. Local newspapers took up the story. What they found when they began to investigate her past was staggering. Mary Ann Cotton had moved repeatedly around the northeast of England over nearly 20 years. Wherever she went, people died. 3 husbands, a lover, her own mother, a friend, 11 of her own children, stepchildren. The deaths had been scattered across different locations, recorded by different doctors, all attributed to the same vague ailments. Nobody had connected them. Nobody had ever looked at the whole picture. Now they did. The trial of Mary Ann Cotton began on 5th March 1873 at Durham Assizes. The trial had been delayed because Mary Ann was pregnant at the time of her arrest. She gave birth in Durham Jail on 7th January 1873 to her 13th and final child, a daughter she named Margaret Edith Quick Manning Cotton. The baby was taken from her. The prosecution was led by Charles Russell. The defense was led by Thomas Campbell Foster. The judge was Mr. Justice Archibald. Mary Ann was charged with the murder of Charles Edward Cotton. The prosecution presented the medical evidence, arsenic found in the body of the child, and the unmistakable pattern of deaths that had followed Mary Ann throughout her adult life. The defense argued that Charles had inhaled arsenic from the green dye used in wallpaper, a not entirely implausible argument in an era when arsenic was commonly used in household dyes and paints. The defense also suggested the chemist who had prepared medicine for the boy may have confused arsenic powder with bismuth powder by accident. The jury retired for 90 minutes. They returned a guilty verdict. Mary Ann Cotton was sentenced to death. Several petitions were presented to the Home Secretary asking for clemency. All were rejected. On the morning of 24th March 1873, before she was led to the scaffold, Mary Ann was questioned by her Wesleyan minister. After considerable hesitation, she said, "I believe that I poisoned the boy." She was then led out. The hangman was William Calcraft, described by contemporaries as notoriously clumsy. The execution was badly botched. The trapdoor was set too low. When the drop came, the rope was too short to break Mary Ann's neck. Instead of dying instantly, she hung strangling at the end of the rope. Calcraft was forced to press down on her shoulders to finish the job. It took approximately 3 minutes for Mary Ann Cotton to die. She was 40 years old. The exact number of people Mary Ann Cotton killed will never be known. Records from the period were incomplete. Many deaths were never properly investigated, and the symptoms of arsenic poisoning were almost indistinguishable from the gastric ailments that claimed thousands of Victorian lives every year. Most sources believe her victims numbered somewhere between 15 and 21. 11 of her 13 children died in her care. 3 of her 4 husbands died. Her mother died. Her lover Notorious died. Her friend Margaret Cotton died. She was convicted of only one murder, the death of her 7-year-old stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. Of her 13 children, only 2 survived her. Her daughter, Margaret Edith, born in Durham Jail in January 1873, and her son George, the child James Robinson had kept when he threw her out. In the northeast of England, after the hanging, children began to skip rope to a rhyme. It went like this: Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten, lying in bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, oh what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton is tied up with string, where, up in the air, selling black puddings a penny a pair. She had been born in Low Morsley on the 31st of October 1832, in a small colliery village in County Durham that the world had never heard of and had no reason to remember. She died on a scaffold in Durham on the 24th of March 1873. Between those 2 dates, in the ordinary colliery houses and terrace streets of the northeast of England, surrounded by her own children, her husbands, and her neighbours, she killed and killed and killed again, and nobody noticed for nearly 20 years. Hello everyone, thank you for listening, and drop any feedback below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I hope to see you again in the next case right here on Cold Case UK.